This chapter will be an introduction to using maps within a material. So far, we've only applied flat colors to the diffuse channel. Let's now use a map to vary a color. I'll go over to the backdrop material, and I want to add something into this diffuse color slot. I could do that in a couple of ways. I could open up the Maps rollout, and you'll see diffuse color here. And I can click on this big None button. However, I can also do that from up here because there's an identical button here. That's just a shortcut. It's a little bit easier for me to get to. If I click on that, I get the Material Map Browser window open. These are all the possible maps that I could apply to this diffuse color channel. All of these, with the exception of bitmap, are so-called procedural maps. A bitmap is a file on disk, like a TIFF file or a JPEG file. The rest of these are all generated internally by 3ds Max. So for example, I could choose the cellular procedural map, and I'll double-click on that. And now you see I've got a pattern here. Now I don't see it on the actual object yet, even though this material is assigned to the object. In order to see the map on the surface of the object in the viewport, I have to click this button here that says Show Shaded Material in Viewport. And if I do this here, I'm doing it at the level of the cellular map. I'll click it. And now you see I've got a pattern in the viewport. Tell you what, let's look at this in active shade so we can see it a little bit more precisely. I'll choose Perspective, Extended Viewports, Active Shade. It takes a little bit longer to think about it. But now you'll see I've got a pretty good representation here. You'll notice that the scale of the dots is different. What you see in the viewport renderer by default is not necessarily an accurate representation. The actual renderer or the active shade renderer will show you what you're really going to get. Each procedural map has different parameters. For this cellular map, I can, for example, change the size. Maybe I'll make that a size of 10. And the active shade takes a moment to think about it, and now it updates. You can have a lot of fun with procedural maps, and they're very useful because they're resolution independent. They're not dependent upon a pixel-based image, and that means that you can zoom in very close to a procedural map and it won't break up into a mosaic of pixels. So let's try another procedural map. You'll see up here the diffuse color has got a cellular map in it, and if I click on this button that says Cellular, I'll get the Material Map Browser up again, and I can choose a different type of map. For example, noise. That's actually the one that you use most commonly. I'll double-click that, and I get a dialog asking me, do I want to discard the old map, or do I want to put this new one as a sub-map inside the current map? Well, usually you don't want to make a sub-map. You don't want to have nested maps unless you specifically choose that. In this case, I'll choose Discard, and click OK. And now the noise map is showing up on the backdrop instead of the cellular map. And again, I can play around with parameters such as size. Maybe I'll set this down to a value of maybe 15. And there's lots of other fun things I can do, like I can change these thresholds to increase the contrast. Maybe I'll set the high threshold to 0.5 and the low threshold to 0.45. And now I've got a much more contrasty look. I can play around with fractal noise and so on. Cool. I could add more complexity to this if I wanted to, because you can see that within the procedural map, I've got color swatches. And in fact, each one of these color swatches has a map channel too. In fact, I could actually add another map inside this existing map, and that's what's meant by a submap. In this case, I'm just going to leave well enough alone. And that's a really basic introduction to procedural maps in the Material Editor.